The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 4th chapter. We're beginning at verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The gospel of the Lord. Please have a seat. So we're talking today about what seems in the beginning to be a lost cause. And so this is an experience that I think we've all felt at one time or another. I ordinarily will offer an experience I had as a way of illustrating our way into the story. But today, I thought since this is such a common human experience, we would share our stories with one another. So here we go. I thought it was all over when I fell off the cliff. It's good to have you here, Bill. I thought it was all over when I saw Jesus coming back. Yep. I thought it was all over when I gave the command to arm the nuclear warheads. We either have very important people or, jokesters with us, but that would be one of them, yeah. I thought it was all over when I lost my son. I thought it was all over when my daughter died, September 13th, 2021. I thought it was all over when I thought I'd had a heart attack at Peterbilt, where I'd been working as on the line, the assembly line. Wow, 1999. I thought it was all over when my ex said he wanted a divorce. I thought it was all over when my fiancée broke up with me. I thought it was all over when I didn't get to buy the house I initially wanted, but later bought a house that had better quality construction and location. I thought it was all over when a huge wave kept pushing me down while I was swimming in the ocean. Growing up on the beach, I know a little something about that. If you decide you can out-muscle a wave, incorrect. I thought it was all over when my dad suffered a cardiac arrest. I thought it was all over when the helicopter crashed. Yep. I thought it was all over when my marriage failed. I thought it was all over when my husband died. I thought it was all over when I felt like God wasn't listening to me. I thought it was all over when for weeks I ate one small meal a day, had less than $10 in my bank account, dropped out of college, and was alone. I thought it was all over when I didn't know what career I was going to have. I thought it was all over when my marriage ended. I thought it was all over when I asked my husband for a divorce. I thought it was all over when I was unemployed and desperate. I thought it was all over when I almost died due to health complications. Thank you for your stories. Here's my story. I thought it was all over for me when he pointed the shotgun at my chest. It's not what you think. I was shooting trap. Now, if you don't know what trap is, it's where a squad of 5 people stand in a line at 5 stations, and there is what's called a trap house, and it throws clay frisbees about this big out in front of you, and you try to shoot them with a shotgun. It's called trap. Don't know why, but it is. And on the squad, you each stand, 4, 5, 6 feet from the guy next to you, and you shoot in turn. Well, you shoot unless your gun misfires, which happened to the guy immediately to my right. He pulled the trigger and got a click, not a bang. Now, what he should have done was eject the shell, load a new one, and continue firing. And if he couldn't eject it, if he couldn't clear the chamber, and you never know if that's a round that will go off or not, he should have held the gun straight up, as we're all trained to do, and walked off the field. He did neither. Instead, what he did was take the gun, here's the barrel, and he turned it like this, and he started to shake it. Guess where I am? Right here, going like this. Now, what I should have done is move, but I couldn't. I froze solid. Number one, I couldn't believe what was happening, and number two, I thought I was going to die. You'd think that would have got me moving, but no. I just stared at him in disbelief. So I learned 3 things that day. Number one, when somebody points a gun at you by accident, move out of the way. Second thing I learned is when a firearm is pointed at you, the barrel looks big enough to shoot something like a watermelon at you. You know, if you've ever seen a shotgun, the opening of the barrel is about the size of a nickel. But when the shotgun is pointing at you, it looks like you could fit your whole head inside the barrel. I don't know why that is, but that's what I experienced. The last thing I learned is that my dad was paying very close attention to what was going on in my squad. My frozen state, I think, lasted maybe 2 seconds, 3 seconds, not very long. And I snapped out of it when I heard my dad, with that tone that fathers have, that all children recognize. Somebody came pounding onto the field, yelled, "Cease fire!" And before I knew it, my dad was in between me and the guy with the gun, and he very gently took it from him, pointed it straight up, and walked off the field with it. In short, I was saved. Thankfully, I've never had to contemplate my imminent demise for any more than a few seconds, certainly not nearly as long as the disciples had to think about going to the bottom of the sea in a storm out there on the Galilean lake. But we all, as we know now, have our moments, don't we? And they're all serious, and quite apparently they all leave their mark on us. So let's sail out on the Sea of Galilee with Jesus and his disciples and see what's going on with their fateful moment. The first thing I want to talk about is the main feature of the story, and of course that is the miracle. Take the miracle out of the story, and it's just a bad day on the lake. Might be a tragic day, but certainly a bad day. That's how most of us read the story, most of us moderns. But that's not how they would have read it in the first century, especially in the Jewish homeland. The very first thing any Jew would notice is the storm at sea itself. And the at sea thing is the important part. Here's why. Israel was not a seafaring people. They pretty much hugged the shore, and when they had to venture farther from shore, as fishermen do, it was a fear-laden adventure. There were no YMCAs in the ancient world to teach you how to swim. In general, nobody knew how to swim, so if you went into the water and somebody didn't fish you right out, well, it was goodbye. There's another thing a stormy sea voyage would have evoked in the first century, and it serves, I think, to give the miracle its meaning to its first hearers. Put yourself in the shoes of a first century Jew who's hearing a story about a crisis involving water. What might that call to mind? Well, let's start in the beginning. Well, actually at the beginning, right? The first thing you might think of is the creation story. The Spirit of God is blowing over the waters, dark and formless and deep. And what does God do? God imposes order on those chaotic waters, right? The Bible says he separates the upper waters from the lower waters, and then he separates the lower waters into dry land and to ocean. And so from the very beginning, water represents chaos and danger and disorder and threat. What comes next? Well, Noah's Ark might come next. The flood. Very little in that story to redeem water's reputation. Then there's the parting of the Red Sea during the escape from Egypt. Then the parting of the Jordan River as you know, the wanderers actually cross the River Jordan and begin to take possession of the land of promise. So incidents involving water bookend Israel's self-understanding, its history. Then we enter the New Testament, and Jesus walks on water, right? He turns water into wine. He's baptized in the Jordan River. And here he tells the storm to, quiet down. So what does it all mean? Well, I think two things. It's a reminder that God's power is superior even to the power of weather. And it's a declaration. If God can defeat the weather, and Jesus defeats the threatening fury of the sea, what does that say about Jesus? Well, if A equals B and B equals C, all you mathematicians, A equals C. Jesus is God. Now, Mark never comes out and says that in so many words. Only John, the Gospel of John, portrays Jesus saying that he is God. I and the Father are one. But it's the unmistakable claim that Mark is here making. Like we've talked about before, Mark can say a whole lot in a very few words, and he's doing it here. A few chapters back, Mark tells us why Jesus has come. In chapter 1, Jesus says, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." Okay, that's the why Jesus is here. Here in chapter 4, we get the who. Jesus is God in the flesh, wielding all the divine power that God had from the very beginning. The very same God who subdued the waters in creation now subdues them in the storm. Mark also has something to say about who it is who's opposing Jesus' mission. And again, he does it in a subtle way. Mark tells us Jesus rebukes the wind and orders the sea to be silent. Does that sound familiar to you? Where have we heard that specific language before? Well, back in Mark chapter 1, Jesus confronts an evil spirit like this. Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent." So here in chapter 4, Jesus speaks to the storm in the language of exorcism. So in this storm, we are seeing a cosmic battle play out in the mind of Mark, the forces of good versus the forces of evil, calm versus chaos, peace versus panic. Why is this so important for Mark to include in his telling of Jesus' story? Well, I think Mark wants us to understand that the arena of God's activity extends beyond what we can perceive. Who would guess a storm at sea could be an expression of evil, an unleashing of power with malign intent? This storm is no ordinary storm. It's meant to frustrate God's plan. It is a metaphor, if you will, for evil's attempt to derail Jesus' saving mission. We see the same thing in his temptation. It just isn't cloaked quite like it is here in chapter 4. Now, we don't think that way anymore about, the weather, really. We don't see evil behind natural disasters, mostly. We still call earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes acts of God. I don't know why we're blaming God for it all, but what we mean by that is it's outside of our control, right? It's something beyond our ability to anticipate or effect. Here in Mark, though, that's exactly the point. These things aren't in our control. Storms aren't in our control. Bad weather, not in our control. But it is in God's control. So what does God do with this control? He intervenes on our behalf. The forces of evil want to swamp the disciples and scuttle their mission. Jesus, wielding divine power again, evicts evil from the scene and restores calm and order. And arriving safely at their intended destination, Jesus and his disciples get out of the boat and go on with their work. Okay, all of this is great for the disciples. But what does it mean for us? We know God's power is greater than the natural forces of earth and sky. We know that this overarching battle between good and evil manifests itself in places we don't expect. We know that sometimes we can get caught up in this battle. But what are we as modern, empirically thinking folks supposed to take away from this supernatural story? Well, again, let's put ourselves in the same boat as the disciples for a moment. How would the story have been different if Jesus hadn't been with them? What would the outcome have been if Jesus was somewhere else instead of napping at the end of the boat? Well, the Bible gives us a hint at what would have happened. In the next chapter, the disciples are in the boat by themselves when another storm kicks up and threatens to swamp them. This time, Jesus isn't with them. Do you remember where Jesus is? He's on the shore. And he walks out to them, and Peter says, "Hey, I want to take a walk with you, Jesus." You know the story. Once everybody is back in the boat, the storm relents and everybody comes out just fine. Taken together, what do these two stories illustrate? They illustrate something as true today as it was back then. Without God in your life, life is too much to handle. It's too chaotic, too unpredictable, too threatening, too big, too powerful for us to handle on our own. Without Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, life is simply unnavigable. Isn't that right? How many of you have ever wondered how people get through the loss of a loved one without faith? How many of you have actually seen people without faith become lost in their grief, or worse, get overcome by their grief? I have. Maybe you have too. I don't know how they do it, to be honest with you. I don't know if they actually get through it at all in a way we would recognize. But the good news is we don't have to imagine going through the stormy parts of life without God, do we? Because the punchline of the story is God shows up. He may not show up when, he may not show up how, but somehow God shows up. He shows up in power. He shows up in power for us. Now, I'm not saying that, all we got to do is love God and we never have to go through tragedy. We understand that's not true, right? We've lived that truth. And it doesn't mean if God is in our life, then it won't be unpredictable. It won't always be calm or benign. We won't always have smooth sailing. Sometimes we might get battered pretty dang good. But what this does mean, Jesus with us, is we won't get sunk when we call on God for help. One of the hardest tasks the Bible has is to find ways to express just how powerful God is. And so, what does the Bible say? Well, he's more powerful than a storm. He is more powerful than the Romans. He is more powerful than hate and disease, even death. And it's hard for the Bible to get across how present God is as well. I think this story here, the one we have in Mark, does both pretty darn well. In this story, Jesus is literally in the same boat as his disciples. He's present and powerful. He takes a near shipwreck and certain death, and with a word calms everything down. He was there to do it for the disciples, and he's here to do it for you. Again, if you want him to. There are all kinds of things we can turn to when things get rough, right? Not are all equally useful. We can turn inward and isolate ourselves from everything outside of us. We can turn to chemical additives, right? Everybody knows Uncle Somebody who likes to tip a few too many back at Thanksgiving time. There's probably something underneath that use. And Jesus won't automatically barge into every crisis we face. He's not that way. Notice the disciples have to wake Jesus up and explain to him what they're going through before he intervenes, right? Well, that's what the disciples experienced that day in that boat, on that lake, in that storm. And we know something about storms, right? We have lived storms. We have been in storms. We can describe storms. What's the good news? We're here to describe them. We didn't sink. We didn't end. We weren't destroyed by that which was besetting us, right? It's important to remember that the next time a storm shows up in your life, right? Very interestingly, and I've talked about how brilliantly Mark, with the minimum number of words, shapes his stories and delivers his points. But did you find it interesting that this story ends with a question that the story is designed to answer? How does the story end? The disciples say, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I don't think Mark wrote that where he wrote it to ask the disciples. I think he wrote it to ask us. I think that is Mark's question to all of us, having gone through the storm with the disciples in the boat and seen what Jesus ultimately had the power to do. I want you to remember that, if you would. Remember how Jesus showed up when you were in this story. You've all been there. Remember that the next time the winds kick up and the waves start to present themselves. And remember that when your neighbor finds himself or herself in stormy waters as well. Because, dear friends, every single one of you has a story to tell about the day you were in the boat and Jesus showed up to do what only Jesus can do.